Hi, my name is Philip Chipping with Operation Read, co-founder, and I'm with Sherry Evans, also co-founder of Operation Read, and we're talking today about IEPs and 504s, and we're going to talk about a couple of different points. It's a big topic, something that could take hours to discuss. We're going to do a short version, and then I'll ask Sherry some more questions that will dive deeper into it. So we hope you at least stay with us for 5 to 10 minutes for the short version. And then we'll dive in. Sherry is the Director of Education for Operation Read, and she has been tutoring and has been running a tutoring business with numerous other tutors and served hundreds of children over the last 10 years. And this is her passion. She studies it voraciously just for fun. And so welcome, Sherry. Thank you for taking some time today. Obviously, this is a big topic and it's a very important topic. IEPs and 504s affect a lot of families. And just some of the questions that I have off the top of my head. What is the difference between an IEP and a 504, and how do I know which one my child needs? Uh, does every public school offer them? I'm assuming they have to. Do I need a professional diagnosis in order for my child to qualify for one of these aids? And then I've got some more questions for later, but those are some good start off questions. So I'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you. And remind me some of those questions at the end if I don't cover them in this little short presentation. But I'll share a screen really quickly just so that we can talk about these different aspects. Let me pull up the correct ones. Okay, can you see this one? Understanding the difference?
Yes.
So this is just a small infographic that just puts it in a nutshell. It's obviously much more involved than this, and we'll talk a little more in depth, but not a whole lot. So here's the difference between an IEP and a 504 and how they overlap, because there are some things that they have in common. They're also governed by different bodies. So IEP falls under IDEA, which is a federal law, and it was originally passed in 1975, and it has undergone some revisions since then, but that's when it originated. So under IDEA, which stands for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the act was actually put in place because individuals with disabilities were not being served. In fact, quite the opposite. They were placed in isolated schools. Some of them were not allowed to go to school. They were not getting proper services. And because of some statutes that came about from legal cases, this was changed. It was drastically changed. So an IEP is part of IDEA law. And so, yes, every school has to have this. This is a federal law. An IEP stands for an individualized education program. I've heard it said as a plan as well. So it's an individualized education program, which means that this has to be individualized to every student who is receiving services under IDEA. So the components of an IEP, so it's special education services provided to meet the student's individualized needs. This is a federal special education law protecting children with disabilities. We talked about that. So the requirements to get an IEP needs to be one or more of the 13 specific disabilities listed in IDEA, and I will show those in just a minute. The disabilities must affect child's educational performance and or ability to learn. Talk about that one really quickly. I've worked with a lot of parents who have had their children assessed and they still don't qualify for an IEP, and it makes them a little frustrated. It's a difficult thing for a school because they will assess the child and then they determine whether or not that child is eligible for services. Some of the kiddos who maybe they're a really bright student and they're getting good grades in other areas, in fact, A's and, really high grades. And then in reading, they're not quite up to those levels of education, but they're still within their peer grade level area, even though it's not really up to their potential because of their high IQ or their other abilities. So they won't qualify for services, which can be a little bit frustrating. It has to be affecting their educational performance or their ability to learn, and that can be a little ambiguous. So that was kind of a tricky one. If they don't qualify for an IEP, they can certainly look at a 504. Now, a 504 plan is governed by the civil liberties laws. So this is a little broader as far as disabilities that are covered. So it will cover a few more. What I will say is dyslexia is included in both IDEA with an IEP and the civil liberties law, which is a 504. So they can get either or. Generally speaking, if you have an IEP, you can include accommodations in that and don't necessarily need a 504, but maybe. That's another kind of interesting one. So a 504 plan basically just says that every child, no child can be discriminated against if they have disabilities. So this is a plan for how a child will have access to learning at school. An IEP may include pull-out services. So they're going to another room to get some instruction, or maybe it's a behavior issue and they need to work with a behavior specialist. It might be that they need speech and language or occupational therapy. So they will have pull-out services with an IEP, possibly. In a 504, these are to give a student accommodations within the classroom. So it's a federal law we talked about to stop discrimination. The 504 requirements are a child has any disability, which can include a learning disability. So it's broader as far as disabilities go. Must interfere with the child's ability to learn in a general education classroom, and it has a broader definition of disability. The way that they are both alike is there's no cost, and we'll talk about that in just one second. Under IDEA, requires parent permission for evaluations in both of them, and they can both include educational accommodations. So under IDEA, it was one of the biggest, and we'll hear about this, in schools, and especially if you're a professional, one of the biggest aspects of under IDEA is called FAPE, FAPE. It stands for Free Appropriate Public Education, and that these children with disabilities are entitled to that. So free, we get it. Public schools are free. Public education, it is public education. The part that gets muddled is the appropriate, the A. What is appropriate for each student? And there's been a lot of litigation and cases that have gone to the Supreme Court because they were trying to figure out what appropriate is. All I will say here, because that's a big topic, is that it used to be that they would require minimal progress, like barely progress, still said, oh, they're succeeding in their IEP. There was a litigation case that came back, and the judge said, if they're barely making progress, why are they even doing this? So now the goals have to be more rigorous. They need to have the child stretch a little bit, and there needs to be more significant progress shown in an IEP. I don't know that that's always done, but that's what it should happen in there. When the child has FAPE, a free appropriate public education, they must do so in the least restrictive environment, and it's known as LRE. So the least restrictive environment obviously is the general education classroom. So as much as we can do in a general education classroom for these students with disabilities is the best scenario. So for example, if a child has dyslexia and they have either an IEP or a 504 plan and they have accommodations in there, accommodations are there to just put them on an even playing field. Accommodation could be something like a student with dyslexia in the classroom can use text to speech or speech to text technology. They can be allowed more time on tests. They can have tests read to them. I have had students that have used apps that you can take a picture of some text and have a little earbud in, and it will read the text to them. Access to a spell checker, things like don't pass assignments back to the child behind you to score them. It's humiliating for a child who can't spell to have their peers look at that. Another one that I will tell parents to ask for is to not have the student called on to read out loud in classroom. It creates massive amounts of anxiety, and kids start to not want to go to school. They get stomach aches and headaches, and they miss a lot of school. So those are some of the accommodations. There are lots. I have a whole list of those, but I don't want to spend a bunch of time going into those. So keep questions in mind if you have them when they come. So these are the 9 key parts of an IEP. And actually, there's 8 key parts. They added the goal review at the beginning, and I'm going to go over these really quickly.
Did you change the slide? Because I'm not seeing a different slide.
Yes, sometimes I have to stop sharing and then share again. So let's do this.
So just start over once you've got it up.
Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. So now we will talk about the key parts of an IEP, and every IEP has to have this. An IEP is a legal document. It must include parents' participation. It must, not optional. A parent can either request an evaluation or a teacher can refer for an evaluation. Either way, the parent must be notified and the parent must sign giving permission to do anything. Any changes that are made in an IEP, any meeting that's held on the behalf of a parent's child, the parent's participation is required. So they will do these once a year, the IEP review. However, a lot of parents don't know that you can call for an IEP meeting anytime you want. It could be 2 or 3 times a year. If you see that something isn't being done, or that there's a slide back in progress and not really forward progress, or you're not seeing progress at home, or you feel like something needs to change, you can call an IEP meeting. The one thing I will suggest to parents, if you want to start an evaluation, and we'll talk about that in another video, or an assessment, or you're doing any communication with your teacher or the principal or any of the IEP team members, do it in writing. Even if you have a phone call, send an email when you're finished to, several people so that it goes out there, principal, teacher, some of the IEP team, special education teacher, and just say, it was nice to meet with you today. Just to summarize, this is what we talked about. Just have it in writing. There's the old saying that says, if it isn't written, it wasn't said. So write everything down, and then keep a binder with some things in, and we can talk about a binder down the road as well, because they're really beneficial to have. So when you're in for your second or subsequent IEP meeting, there will be a goal review and progress on the prior year's IEP goals. So even when you begin, this is what has to be included: present levels of performance. They will do an evaluation to see where the child is. Several different evaluations and assessments are used to do this. They talk about strengths and weaknesses and where things need to change, where they need extra help. There has to be progress reporting. So how the student will make progress toward goals and how the progress will be measured. This one is so important. You want to know what is going to happen in order to meet the goals that they talk about, and how are they going to monitor that, and how will it be measured. So that's really important. Then they will go over the annual IEP goals. So they have to be clear and measurable to work on the upcoming year in each domain that the child is getting assistance in. So for example, if a child has dyslexia, they're going to get some assistance in reading and phonemic awareness and those kinds of things. And if they have a struggle in writing, especially if it's a kind of a physical problem, they might meet with an occupational therapist to help with their handwriting. A lot of dyslexic kiddos also have speech trouble, and they may also meet with a speech and language pathologist. And each of those will have their own goals. So that's when they'll set up the goals, is in that meeting, and they have to be measurable. Also, they need to be pushing the student a little bit so that they're actually progressing. Special education and related services. So what services will the child receive and for how long? That will be included in there. Then they will talk about the supplementary aids and services. So this is where the accommodations will come in. What accommodations and modifications the child will receive at school. And we talked about a few of those, and we can delve into that down the road. Extent of non-participation in general education. This one's really important. So time outside of the general education classroom must be justified and based on the student's needs. This takes us back to least restrictive environment. When things can be done in the classroom, they ought to be done in the classroom. Now, with a student with dyslexia, they're pulled out for reading instruction, that's probably not going to be able to be done in the regular classroom because they need a different system to learn how to read. So that's not being taught in their general education classroom. They will likely be pulled out for that. But all of the accommodations that come with it can be done in the general education classroom. There are also other things that can be done in the general education classroom, like if they need to have an aide with them to take notes for them or read tests to them, that can be done within the classroom. A lot of students don't like that because it makes them stand out. And I would always take into consideration how the student feels about having accommodations within the classroom, because they're anxious anyway and their self-esteem is bad anyway. So I would always include the child in talking about some of these things, and you want them to eventually learn to advocate for themselves. And it's a good way to start to talk to them about why they're doing what they're doing, and explain what the goals are and how they're going to progress through this. Statewide assessments. So it will state what assessments the student needs to take, the statewide assessments and accommodations. There are accommodations available for assessments, the state assessments. So make sure that you know what those are and that what you can take advantage of. How is the service going to be delivered? So offer of FAPE, we talked about that, and an explanation of student placement. So like I said, sometimes a student won't have the opportunity to be placed to receive an IEP, but 504 is a good place to at least start with accommodations. One other thing I will say about an IEP, especially in reading, oftentimes special education services for learning disabilities populations, their most effective tool is in supporting the student with supportive services. It may include assistive technologies in the accommodations. And this is changing slowly, too slowly, but most of my experience with students that have IEPs are not receiving appropriate interventions in their special education class to teach them to read. This is why I'm getting students that are in 4th, 5th grade, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, adults, even adults, because what they were using in their special education setting was not evidence-based, is not being given by someone who's trained to give it, or it is not done with fidelity, which means exactly how it should be given. There's a big gap in where that needs to change. So as a parent, you can ask what they're using for an intervention and then do some research yourself. They will always say they're using an evidence-based intervention because they believe they are. I always say that when we're working with people who don't know what they don't know, we have to give them a little grace. So sometimes as a parent or as a tutor or as a teacher, it's us that educates them. And it's really all of the changes that have been made, and IDEA came about because of parents and parent groups that stepped forward and said, this is not fair for my child. This does not work for my child. And it's parents that have made the biggest impact. So there are ways to communicate with educational services so that you're not offending people because they believe they're doing the right thing. They truly do. They don't want students to fail. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done in special education. And then the last thing I just wanted to show, and then we can go back to some other questions, is, let me find it really quickly. The categories for an IEP. So let me just pull this up. I mentioned that we'd talk about what the categories are. Where did you go? Right here. Okay, Philip, let me know if you can see this.
Yep.
Perfect. So these are the 13 categories of disabilities that can qualify for an IEP. Specific learning disability. Look at this one. 35% of our school-age kids that are receiving special education services by far are above the other disabilities. This is where dyslexia falls. So specific learning disability would include difficulties with math or writing or reading. And about 80% of this 35% are students with dyslexia or reading struggles. To backtrack very quickly, schools cannot diagnose dyslexia. They can assess for services, but they cannot diagnose. For a diagnosis, there needs to be an outside evaluation. Again, we'll talk about evaluations in another video, but the school can't diagnose. So just understand that. When they assess the child, they're looking to see if they meet the criteria for services. So about 80% of those are dyslexia, which is a huge number when you go nationwide. 18%, well, we don't go into the percentages. So speech or language impairment, other health impairment, including ADHD, autism, intellectual disability, emotional disturbance. So this would be some of the behavior issue kids that can receive services, developmental delay, multiple disabilities, and remember this also includes physical disabilities, hearing impairment, orthopedic impairment, visual impairment, traumatic brain injury, and deaf blindness. So those are the 13 categories for kids to be able to receive an IEP. Again, a 504 is much broader, so it can include some different things as the school sees fit.
Well, thank you, Sherry. That's great information. Yeah, just so much to dive into. You touched on a couple of things that I want to just ask a little bit more about. Specifically, you said schools can diagnose, or I'm sorry, they can assess for services, but they can't diagnose. It seems a little bit of a conflict of interest to me that the people who give the service have the authority to say whether or not a kid should get the service. And I can see in my mind instances where a school is feeling really overwhelmed. Maybe the resource teachers are feeling overwhelmed. They have a new kid come to the school who really needs the help, but they're just like, nope, sorry. Now, hopefully that would never happen. But what kind of recourse is there for a parent who knows their kid is struggling, but maybe they're testing well enough that they're not throwing up enough red flags? I've talked to parents because these are smart kids. They have high IQs. They're not dumb. They're flying under the radar, like you said, so many cases till 4th, 5th, 6th grade when it becomes a lot more painfully obvious that they're having reading difficulties. So can a parent take their child to a neuropsychologist, get an actual diagnosis, and force the school's hand if they don't like the school's assessment?
Yes and no. So if a parent doesn't agree with the assessment that was done at the school and they want a more in-depth evaluation, the school isn't going to do a broad assessment. They're going to assess for where they see that the child is struggling. In order to get a broad assessment, it needs to be done outside of school. The schools don't always accept an outside evaluation. So this is where it gets tricky. And as far as forcing their hand to take that, there's the process. So if you don't agree with the assessment of your child and you want an outside assessment, and I don't think most parents know this, and I need to look more into the process of this, you can request that your child gets an outside assessment. You've got to give reasons why, and really this will come into what are you seeing at home? How long is it taking? Keep a log of how long it's taking your child to do homework each night, because a lot of times the teachers will say, well, they're getting their homework done and they're understanding, the concepts, and they're, they're getting okay grades. And the parent's like, no, you don't understand. When they're at home, they're spending 5 hours a night on homework, and I have to sit there with them the whole time, reading things to them and explaining things to them. So they're not doing well. I see this at home. So keep track of all of this stuff, amount of time spent on homework, how much help they're receiving, emotional issues that come up, all those things. Keep a kind of a journal or a log, because those will help to support your claim. Now, under IDEA, if a parent requests and has justification for receiving an outside evaluation, the school has to pay for it.
Mm.
Now, there are loopholes, obviously, and I don't think this happens very often, but if a parent wants to push hard enough and figure out how to do that, they can.
Mhm.
Or sometimes insurance will cover it if there are other underlying conditions like anxiety, which is huge in dyslexic kiddos. ADHD is very commonly seen. And so most insurances will cover evaluations across the board for some of those things, which can include all of their academic studies. A lot of schools will take those reports and then still want to do their own assessments. I would also push back a little bit on this, because if you're given the same assessment in a very short amount of time, it can skew the results of the second test because they've just taken it recently. So if they've done testing outside recently, I would strongly suggest that the school doesn't repeat that same assessment. If it's a different assessment, great. But the same assessment should not be repeated more than a year, or any less than a year apart from each other. If you don't agree with decisions the school is making, or if you're having problems with your IEP, there's something called a due process hearing, and you can ask for a due process hearing. This is a legal proceeding. You can't just go to the school and say, I demand you do this, and I want you to change this, because all they know we're not going to do it. Get an advocate, get somebody who knows the law, and file for a due process hearing. And there are several steps in that. The first one is mediation. So you'll meet with someone who will hear both sides, and hopefully you can resolve the conflict in mediation. Schools do not want due process hearings. They don't want them. So if you can work it out with the school to the best of your ability, that's great. Mediator will be that first step. If that doesn't work and there isn't an agreement made, then it can go on to a district and a state level where it's more formal. And at the very end, if it ends up being a full due process hearing, it is overseen by, it's like a court case basically. And whatever is agreed upon, whether it's through mediation or through the court system, it will be a signed legal document. So it's a legal proceeding, but that's the way to do it. If they have a 504, or if their plan isn't being followed, you can also file a complaint with the Civil Liberties. I can't remember the name of the organization, because their civil rights are being violated. So you can go that route as well. And schools don't want that. So if you could work something out with the school, great.
Awesome. Sounds like a lot of hard work, a lot of headache. We know the saying that it's maybe a little bit cliche, but it is that because it's true, right? That the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Yes.
And so really parents need to step up, not be afraid to advocate for their child, and understand that, yeah, this is their civil right. And
Yes.
Most people don't have a hard time standing up when it comes to their kids and
Right.
being the bad guy or being the mama bear or whatever. So really we just strongly encourage you as a parent to do that, and know that you are well within your rights to push back, to be annoying. And that kind of brings me to the next question. Well, there's so much that I would love to ask about the process that you just said, but let's just review. You don't like the assessment, you push back, you try to get a next level assessment. At any time you can go on your own and work directly with the neuropsychologist if you personally want more understanding of what's happening with your child. And if you want more proof or justification for taking some more action. But it seems like all those legal steps could take quite some time. And that whole time your child is existing in a system that's not helping and benefiting. But let's look at the other side. Let's say they get an IEP or 504 pretty quickly. Then can you just sit back and relax and trust that your child's being taken care of? They're in good hands now with the public school system. And I say public school system, and probably most people are like, that's probably not the case. So because you mentioned that a lot of kids aren't actually getting the help that they need. So if they're not actually getting the help that they need, I guess maybe a better question is, or a follow-up question, what we can't expect every parent to become a literacy expert. But what keywords can they ask to determine what kind of intervention strategies or curriculum or education plans are being used, and what power does the parent have at that point over the different curriculum or the different methods that are being used to teach their child?
So I often tell my parents, I'm like, no parent wants to be that parent that's going in that the administrators run the other direction when they see them. So whenever communicating with a school, the best first approach is, can you help me understand this? Or this is what I see. Can we talk about what we can do together to make this work together as much as you can, maintain those relationships. Many schools are really happy to do that. There are occasionally schools that will really give a lot of pushback, and then you kind of have to become a little more assertive. I don't ever want to use the word aggressive. But as a parent, the thing that you would have to do at that point is do a lot of your own research or find someone who does know, like an advocate, and have them teach you and walk you through the process. I wish that parents could just sit back and believe that everything was being done for their child. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And I do not blame the teachers at all. I want to make that very clear. They're doing the best they can with what they know and what they have. I do know that in research that I've done, one of the themes that comes up over and over and over again is, even when they have evidence-based curriculum, the thing that is most important is the education and the training of those who are implementing it, because it needs to be individualized. And so when you know that individual child, if they have dyslexia, they may need more help in decoding, the words, but their vocabulary is great and their comprehension is great. The reading comprehension may be low, but so you differentiate that instruction. But if you don't know the components to look for, you can't do that. So for a parent, the best thing to do is to be educated and start to learn as much as you can about dyslexia, what works, what doesn't work, and what evidence-based instruction actually means. When you ask the school, it's pretty simple. If your child's going to be pulled out for reading intervention, you can just simply ask, what curriculum or intervention will you be using with my child to teach them to read? Pretty simple. If they're going in for writing, what curriculum or methods will you be using to teach my child to write? Same thing with math, same thing with anything. You probably won't be able to ask them if it's evidence-based, because they believe what they're using is evidence-based and is working. Oftentimes, there's a case study that I read where a student was making, his reading score went from 6.2, which means the second month in sixth grade, all the way through the end of the year, moved up to a 6.8. So he made a half a grade's worth of progress in a year. And the school considered that progress. It was minimal progress, but was it sufficient progress? No. So then it begs the question, what are they teaching these kids? So find out what they're using, the curriculum they're using, and then do some research. And again, reach out. You can reach out to us if you have questions about a certain curriculum, because they can say it's evidence-based when it isn't. So we have to be careful about that. So that's that answer.
Well, yeah, and to that point, we know for a fact that for so many years, the whole language, the balanced reading, the 3 cueing, And we've talked about this before, and we'll eventually do a video, probably a series of videos just on those programs. But they were taught across the world for decades, despite evidence to the contrary that they didn't work. And they are still taught in places in America. So I think the keywords that you want to be looking out for are evidence-based doesn't matter. So you don't even ask about that anymore. But if they say anything to do with whole language, balanced reading, or 3Qing, you need to challenge that, because it's shown, especially for struggling and dyslexic readers, that they need a very structured literacy, science of reading, phonics-based approach. And if they are not getting that, and hooked on phonics is not enough either, right?
No.
Because hooked on phonics is a phonics-based approach, but it's a simplified. Your kid, as a struggling or dyslexic reader, instead of needing like 20 or 30 phonics lessons, needs like 80 to 100, much more granular, much more focused, a lot more repetition and practice on each individual level. So really your keywords are on the negative side: whole reading, balanced, or whole language, balanced reading, 3Qing, any program that essentially at its nature has kids guessing at the meaning of words, literally sometimes even covering words up to guess the meaning based on the context clues, based on the pictures. They're not being taught how to sound out the portions of the word, how to decode a word, which really is the foundational skill of reading, or one of the foundational skills of reading. And then on the good side, again, you've got phonics-based structured literacy, science of reading. If you hear Orton Gillingham, those are that's an approach. There are a lot of practitioners of Orton Gillingham, different companies. Those are all phonics-based curriculum. So those are some of the good ones. If you hear it's gaining popularity today, Letters, LETRS, that's a great program. But that kind of brings me to another question. If they're doing individual one-on-one work, that's great. But if and I don't know enough about it. My three oldest kids were struggling readers, but I intervened as a parent. None of my kids had dyslexia, but they had three other problems. And so that's when and why I started becoming really passionate about this. So I don't know, because I never had to do IEPs or 504s, but if they're doing in-class intervention, or maybe even when they pull kids out, is it always one-on-one, or do they try to do small group instruction? Do they have 4 or 5 kids who are all struggling that they try to teach together? And if they do, will that help? Does that work in that setting? How many kids can be taught together if they're struggling or dyslexic readers?
That's a really good question. One-to-one is always best. It's been shown in research that one-to-one is best. And generally they're taught in small groups. That's a question I would ask. Are they going to be in a small group? How large is the group? And how is that group managed? So one-to-one is best because you can go at the student pace. When you have a small group, you really ought to not move the group forward until the one that's struggling the most is caught up.
Mm-hmm.
If that, well, that can create issues because it will hold some of the other kids back. But what often happens is they don't wait for that one to catch up. They just move forward.
Yeah.
And so some of those kids are going to fall behind in a small group.
Yeah. So who's the best tutor? Sherry?
Me,
Yeah, well,
the best tutor. I'm
if
kidding.
a parent can't, if a school, because the nice thing about the public school system, and the reason it's made into law is because this is a basic fundamental human right, um, and shouldn't be dependent upon a person's income level, right? But we know that one-on-one tutoring costs $500 a month
Right.
in Utah, which means on the East Coast probably costs 1,000 or 1,500 a month. So one-on-one tutoring is financially not feasible for a lot of people. So if the schools aren't cutting it, who's the next best, most affordable coach, I guess? And
The
yes, I'm
parent.
leading you, and I apologize if you
It's the
don't know.
parent. Yeah, the
Yeah,
parent. And that requires a lot of knowledge and preparation. But yes, a parent can absolutely intervene and step in if they learn,
yeah,
have an appropriate system and learn how to implement that system.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
And it can be done. It doesn't have to be homeschooling, doesn't have to be 8 hours a day. Um, so you've got two options as a parent. You step up and you step in, and I like, Sherry, how you talk about not being adversarial, not being confrontational, but saying, approaching it with teachers and administrators in a way that you're saying, help me understand this. This is what I'm reading. This is what I'm hearing from other experts. Help me understand why you guys are doing it this way, or is it possible to add this component in? And if that's not moving the needle, then yeah, get a little bit assertive,
Yeah.
um, and put your foot down. But ultimately know that there are a lot of resources out there. And that's one of our big goals as our company is trying to provide all of the education, all of the curriculum. But there's other companies that do this also, that to empower you as the parent to be able to teach your child. No child should be left behind, in the sense that every child deserves to know how to read. And
Absolutely.
virtually every child can read successfully. But we find ourselves as a nation with 60% of our kids behind and below reading level. Obviously, the government's not cutting it. Obviously, despite the best intentions of teachers, and we know the teachers in our public school are well-intentioned and trying to do their best, but they're not being given the right tools. And so it really falls on you and as a parent. So good luck, step up, reach out to us if you have any questions or you need some support. We're happy to help in any way, just answering questions. We have a vibrant and growing community on where we answer questions together. Parents answer questions, professional tutors answer questions, as well as our curriculum and our assistive technologies. So we thank you for being here and watching this, and good luck in your journey. We're rooting for you and for your kid, and we'll see you again soon.